Hi, I'm Victoria Peat, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now this is something that we use in patchwork and quilting. If you're like me and you've come from dressmaking and you're moving into the world of patchwork and quilting, 1/4 of an inch seems really small and really alien, because in dressmaking it's normally 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimetres. So a 1/4 of an inch seems really scary. But believe me, you don't want to deal with anything wider than that, because all of a sudden you'll be using loads and loads of fabric and your quilts will end up really bulky. So a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, why is it important to remain consistent? Well, the thing is that in order to create something that isn't really wonky and a little bit all over the place, is you need to make sure that your seam allowances are consistent. Because when you join two pieces of fabric together and you come to join those to another two pieces of fabric, if they're different sizes, all of a sudden things stop being straight and they start being a little bit wonky, and then you'll realise that your points aren't matching and you can quite easily get really frustrated. Now, having points that match are not the be all and end all, and do not stress over it, and don't start unpicking stuff over and over again. Just relax, enjoy the craft, have a really good time, and as you get more experienced, you can start to worry a little bit more about your 1/4 of an inch seam allowances. Now, in order to do your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, you've got two different options. You'll have with your machine, and the machine I've got here is the 720 Pro, which is an Elna, and Janome and Elna are like sisters or cousins, and they'll have a similar machine. This one is aimed at quilters, and if you have a machine that's aimed at a quilter, you will get not only your standard foot, but you might get something like the 1/4 of an inch foot. If you are a beginner, you're starting out, you've got a more basic machine, you've got an older machine, or you've inherited a machine that maybe doesn't come with all of the different feet, I'm hoping that you'll at least have a standard foot with your machine. If you have seen online or in shops, you may see a 1/4 of an inch foot and wonder whether you really need one or what it does. So I'll talk to you about the 1/4 of an inch foot as well. But to start off with, we'll look at the standard foot. So if I just bring that in a little bit closer, this is a foot A, which is your standard straight stitch foot. And on this particular one, you can see here it's relatively wide, and you've got a metal section and a clear section on there. So this is the foot that I'm going to use to begin with. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose a place on this foot that I'm going to use as a guide when I'm sewing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the fabric at the point at which the plastic part here meets the metal part here. See the little join? I'm going to run the edge of my fabric along that line. What you might have with your machine is you might have a slightly narrower foot, and what you can do is you can run the raw edge of your fabric along the side of the foot. So you've got your two options there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop this on the machine to sew to begin with. Let me just move this down so that you can see what I'm doing, sort of. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew two pieces of fabric together. The two pieces of fabric that I have got are 2.5 inches wide in order to do a test. So just to make sure, before I start sewing, I want to just make sure that these two pieces of fabric are exactly the same size. So I'm going to start off with 2.5 inches. Come down a little bit lower, you can see here. So I've cut, it doesn't matter what length they are, but don't go too long, because it's just for a little test, just to make sure that your 1/4 of an inch is accurate. So don't go too long, but you want to make sure that your two pieces are cut really accurately at whatever width you choose. Don't go too narrow, because it makes the job really difficult. Start off with, as I have here, you can start off with 2.5 inches each. And we're going to place these two pieces of fabric right sides together, and we're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I'll place those up against each other. You can pin if you like, but I find that as you gain in confidence with patchworking, that you don't necessarily need to pin. So I'm going to take those, I'm going to place that underneath the machine, and I'm going to place the presser foot down, making sure that my fabric is in the right place. Remember, I said I'm going to place it between the join, between the clear part and the metal part. I'm then going to start stitching with a standard stitch, standard straight stitch as the machine starts up. I'm going to place the fabric just underneath. Oh, just grab a bit of thread from behind. Try not to get my hand totally in the way. And I'm just going to put the needle into the fabric. And I'm going to sew along and just see where that takes us. sew along, keeping my fabric at that point between the clear section and the metal section at that join, or you might be keeping your fabric at the very right hand edge of your foot. Get to the end and trim that off. And so that gives us a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So what I'll do is I will press that, and I press that so that the seams, the seam allowance on the back is being pressed to one side. And what that means is that it allows you to piece these two pieces of fabric against another two pieces of fabric, and you can nest your seams, and it just spreads the seam allowances, and it just helps you try and get a more accurate seam. So once I've got those two sewn together and I've given it a press and the seam allowances have gone to one side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check and see how these pieces of fabric measure up. So I started off with a 2.5 inch piece of fabric. So what I want now is, because I've sewn a 1/4 inch, and that 1/4 inch is underneath here, this needs to be a 1/4 inch smaller. So that I would like this piece of fabric to measure 2.25 inches from the seam allowance to the outside edge. So what I'll do is I'll take my ruler and just butt it up against this join here, this seam, and you can just see it just butts up against that. And I'll hold the ruler and I'll just measure along and just check that that's 2.25 inches, which it is. I'm happy with that. I'll try and hold it up, but it's not very easy because the fabric flops around and you can't quite see behind. But, no, I can't hold it straight. Kind of. You can see there that it's 2.25 inches. Now, if you find that you've done that and this isn't right, it's a little bit shy of that, or it's a little bit too big, what you can do is, rather than moving your fabric, what you can do is you can move your needle position. And frequently with sewing machines, when you are on your straight stitch, which this one is here, if you then go and change your stitch width, what that will do is that will actually change the needle position. So if I move it all the way over to the left, you'll see just a little bit, see that needle moving over to the left hand side. And if I whiz it all the way back to the other side, you can just see that needle moving. So have a look at your machine, stick it on a straight stitch and just see. Let me just see so you can see it, or you can hear it double beeping, so it's gone across to the other side. Have a look and see whether you can just alter it just a smidgen, because what you might find is that the place that you choose, and you might have chosen the outside edge of your presser foot, that point may not give you that quite exact 2.25 inch seam allowance. So by moving your needle position just by a little bit, one way or the other, it might just make it that little bit more accurate. So that's one way of doing that. So that's with your standard presser foot. And if you want to try, if you have with your machine, or you're thinking of buying as an added extra, you might buy a 1/4 inch foot. And with Elna's and Janomi's, this is an O foot. And you can see on the side, it's got like a little rudder just here. And that rudder serves as a guide for your fabric. So when you pop it on the machine, what you might find is with your machine, it might require a different stitch setting. So on this particular one, I've got the zigzag plate on mine. So for mine, it's a stitch 04, and that one automatically moved my needle over to the right hand side. So that means that the machine is set up and absolutely ready to go. So when I stitch now, I'll just see if I can bring this a little bit closer for you so that you can see. Stitching at a slightly funny angle. So I'll press again, same thing, I'll put the presser foot down and I will put the needle in the down position, and the fabric here is sitting right up against that little rudder on the side. So I've lost my presser, my foot pedal, so I'm going to just whiz through, and I'm keeping the fabric up against this little rudder on the side, and it makes life so much easier. So if you have got one in with your machine, dig it out and give it a try, or if you're thinking of buying it as an extra, then it really is worth it if you're doing a lot of patchworking. It makes life so much quicker. So I'll pull that out, and that's got exactly the same thing. So that gives you a 1/4 inch. And the same thing, give that a press, and then you've got your finished sample, and just measure across. Ooh, pick up my ruler, hold it the right way round, and if I can hold it straight, that should give you 2¼ inches. Okay, so those are your two options for trying to get that 2¼ inch. Sorry, I keep saying 2¼ inch, I've got that on my brain. If you're trying to get your accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance, it'll just make life so much easier when you come to join your pieces together at a later stage, and you'll be thinking, oh, why is it not going together? If you've been accurate with your 1/4 inch, you're more than likely going to get things right. And things will just be the right size, because if you just take off, particularly when you're doing more complex pieces with a lot more piecing, a lot more complicated blocks, if you're just taking off a little bit each time, those blocks will end up being smaller and smaller and smaller, and then you just won't get things to fit, and your finished product will be a lot smaller than intended. So 1/4 inch is really important, and take that time to do a bit of a test and just see how you can alter your machine by changing your stitch width or changing your presser foot to see whether that helps you get more accurate. If you've got any questions, leave me a comment or send me a message. I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.